Alright, so me and Julie did our research project on news media bias for crime. The news channels we focused on were CNN and Fox News, and we decided to take a look at how their political views affected the way they told each story. With CNN covering the more liberal side of things, so they focused on stuff that Democrats would be pro for, and Fox News focused more on the conservative side, focusing more on what a Republican would be in favor of. Our original hypothesis was each news station will present the selected articles according to their individual political beliefs. And while we found this was somewhat true, but we also found that it was somewhat not true.
In our code book, we just have the networks listed and then themes that we were looking for, which we were looking for mentions of the family for both victims and offenders, and then occupations for both victims and offenders. We're looking at the time frame so we can have relatively new news stories instead of older ones, whereas the data might be skewed or not even relevant to what's going on now. And then we were checking frequency of minority, race of offender, which kind of goes along with frequency. We were just seeing how much the race of the offender was mentioned in a news article. The gender of offender, which turned out to be kind of important, race of victims, and then gender of victims, and then also the type of crimes committed on the victims.
Alright, for our demographic, we selected 10 news stories from CNN and 10 from Fox News, and each of these stories aligned with each other. So we did the Kavanaugh, not Kavanaugh. We did the senator who's being accused of sexual assault.
Kavanaugh.
Oh yeah, it is Kavanaugh. Anyway, so that guy, and then we did the same thing for CNN and Fox. We aligned the stories with what they said.
So we looked at the race of offender and the race of victim to see how they correlated with each other, and we actually found, surprisingly, that there was no mention of a black offender in any of the news stories, and it was mostly the black people, when they were mentioned, were mostly victims, and the offenders were normally white, which was really strange. And we only had one Latino, that was mentioned in the news articles. So yeah, it was pretty significant.
Alright, our t-test was measuring minority references. And in this we found that using the t-test we compare the numbers of minority references to the race of the offender, and if they were white or if it remained unmentioned. And in doing so we found that if more oftentimes if the offender was white, then minorities were mentioned a lot more often.
We found that the gender of the offender was actually pretty relevant in the news stories. So when there was a female offender, the news really emphasized the fact that she was female. And then they also, every time, the gender of the offender was never in question. It wasn't ever oh, this is just an offender. It was always mentioned in the article.
Alright, and then our implications. We decided that for implications that the media will focus a lot more on a story, if it's on the race of a person, if it is a white offender going for a black victim. For instance, one of our stories was about a female police officer who stumbled into the wrong apartment thinking it was her own, and she shot and killed a black man. And this was it was super emphasized on the fact that she was white and the fact that he was black. In the article, for one of the articles even specified that they believed that this would not have happened if the man had not been black. The number of times minority is mentioned really depended on whether or not the offender was white and if the victim was black, like I just said. Gender, if just what Julia said in the last slide, gender was really focused on for a female and stuff like that. But all in all, we decided that for the most part that the news medias kept fairly similar to each other whenever they were saying something, and we didn't find a lot of differences going back, so our hypothesis was really not found to be all the way true. And the only thing that we did find that was focused on more was that the news stories would only slightly differ from the two stations focused on political beliefs. And along with this, we found that this came into play a lot with ulterior motives. For instance, were the ulterior motives, and we found that For one thing, on the case of the man who did 3D printed guns, like the whole story was supposed to be about how he had sex with a minor and was facing sexual assault charges. However, almost the entire news article was still covering 3D printed guns and if it was okay to have the instructions out and how it could be dangerous. Not even focusing on the fact that a 16-year-old girl had just been coerced to have sex with him for money. And we also found that in the case of Kavanaugh, with his sexual assault charge, the main topic of the story was still focusing on whether or not he should still be involved with the Supreme Court, and was talking about, like, a lot of it's focused on how, like, oh, they need a backup guy, like, they need, like, someone to, like, have backup to go into the Supreme Court, not really focusing on the fact that, like, this woman just accused him of rape. And another thing that we found is that in the CNN article as well, it discussed the 3D printed guns, but this one referenced more of how the Obama administration shut it down, while the Trump administration was allowing for the publication. And then, like, the serial killer, the Border Patrol, whenever he was accused of being the serial killer, the Border Patrol was trying to cover their, like, butts, like, by saying, like, oh, no, we do not accept this kind of behavior, which obviously, like, he killed somebody. Like, we don't accept this kind of behavior, this is not what our department stands for, and we're going to do everything in our power to correct this mistake. Just stuff like that. Like, it wasn't really, like, he wasn't really, like, taking, like, full responsibility for everything and stuff like that. Victim-oriented, that's the word for it. It wasn't victim-oriented. And also, during one of the, like, the apartment shootings, for some reason the news, like, went and they decided to mention a terrorist attack that happened in 2015, which was completely out of context with what the article was talking about. Like, it just didn't go with anything that they were saying and stuff, and it was just, like, this random fun fact that they just added in. But it was just because they had, like, an ulterior motive for the article. They were trying to spark something about terrorism that wasn't even, like, there to be found. Another thing that was found to have, like, an ulterior motive was, like, in the one of the shooting cases, whenever it turned out to be a woman, the whole article ended up being on how, like, oh, she was a female who, like, this was, like, weird, this isn't supposed to happen, this is unsettling for criminologists to believe that she's a female. Like, that was kind of like what they were more focusing on rather than, like, what she actually did. Alright, and that concludes our research, like, topic. We appreciate you guys listening.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna miss you, Miss Blankenship. I mean, Dr. Blankenship. Heck yeah.